Okay, Chair Hansen, call the mechanical board meeting of October 22nd, 2024 in order at 9:33. Katie, would you please call the roll?
Yes. Chair Jay Hansen?
Virtually present.
Yes, thank you. Vice Chair Eric Fanning?
Virtually present.
Thank you. Walter Cottle?
Virtually present.
Thank you, Walter. Chris Miller?
Virtually present.
Thank you, Chris. In the room, Jed Sherman?
Here.
Thank you. Ted Zook is absent. Kevin Duell?
Virtually present.
Thank you, Kevin. Kevin Ferguson?
Virtually present.
Thank you, Kevin. And Edward Louis is also absent, excused. We do have quorum.
All right. Excellent. Do any of the members of this board have any changes to the agenda that we have before us today? If so, speak up. I'm not hearing any speaking. So, Chair Hansen rules the agenda in order and order of business approved. We have our draft minutes of June 5th, 2024. Do we have any changes for our draft minutes that anyone can see? I didn't have any. Hearing none, I will rule that the draft minutes are final and accepted. The next date, the next meeting, we are going to gather together on December 4th of 2024. And same bat time, same bat channel. Pierre, you're going to be up for public comment. If you could, do we have any public comment? Has anybody shown up? We did get some written public comment, but do we have any public comment?
Thank you, Chair Hansen, members of the board. For the record, my name is Pierre Sabab, Policy and also Division. As of this morning, we don't have any requests for oral public comment to the board. We do have one written public comment, as you said, and I believe Katie provided that to the board today from Mr. Mike Moore. He sent in written public comment on agenda item 403 of the OMSC matrix. If the board would like to discuss that now or discuss his public comment when time comes to discuss the matrix, that's completely at the discretion of the board, but I do hope that the board has had time to review that today. Otherwise, we'll hold the line open if there's any other general public comment.
Okay.
Seeing none, I'll pass it back to you, Chair Hansen. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, reports and updates. Chief Heizer, tell us about Hotlanta.
Thank you, Chair Hansen, members of the board. Wasn't very hot, thank goodness.
Thank goodness.
Chilly mornings. And so moving forward, some updates from the mechanical program. Wanted to pass on an update about the rollout of minor labels program for mechanical minor labels. It's moving forward. We're getting lots of questions, trying to get some general questions answered, getting scope resolved on a few pieces, especially when it comes to replacement of equipment, and sometimes in the case of when a fuel change happens. So if helping people get through that. So if you're adding a new gas hookup and new venting out of the building, that's a little outside the scope of the minor label. But also, we are working on a lot of new training materials, and guides are continuing to come out. And in addition, we're working with, especially when it comes to the energy side of what's happening for mechanical code. be looking for more things coming to the site. On commercial energy, we wanted to give you an update that it's looking like January 1st will be the effective start date for the use of 90.1 2022. Meeting with some of the people who are ASHRAE 90.1 meeting in Atlanta this past week. So back from that, they are currently working on what would go in and finalizing what would go into 90.1 2025. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions because most of today's update will be what came out of the code committee and for your review today.
Okay.
Any questions?
Yeah, this is Kevin
Kevin.
Doyle.
Kevin.
Is the January 1st date tentative or is that definite?
So far, it's as definite as we can get at this point. We're still looking for a couple of help items with what's in 90.1 for ComCheck. There are a few, we found one relatively big potential loophole in the envelope portion that we're hoping that they will help us be able to point that out and make it easier for people to get through and not have it could provide some unrealistic expectations for envelope compliance, just to put that right now. We're
Gotcha.
hoping to get that resolved.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mark? Hearing none, we will move on. We have no communications, no appeals, and no unfinished business because we are an excellent committee. We do have new business, very important new business, the 2025 Mechanical Specialty Code. We're going to hear from both Pierre and Mark on this. Pierre, do you want to present this?
Yes. Thank you, Chair Hansen, members of the board. Again, for the record, my name is Pierre Sabah, Policy Analyst for the division. This agenda item is to review and approve the provisions of the 2025 Oregon Mechanical Specialty Code, or known as the OMSC. Some background: ORS 455030 and 455110 required the division adopt a state building code to govern the construction, reconstruction, alteration, and repair of buildings and other structures. The law further requires the building code to contain uniform performance standards providing reasonable safeguards for health, safety, welfare, comfort, and security of the residents of Oregon who are occupants and users of building, and to provide for the use of modern methods, materials, and maximum energy conservation. The division, with the approval of the appropriate board, this board, may amend such codes provided it conforms insofar as is practicable to. And they require that this board, in concert with the RMSB in relation to low-rise dwellings, adopt standards for the installation of the mechanical heating and ventilation devices and equipment. Those standards are the OMSC. This is updated periodically to ensure that the code reflects the current technology, standard practices. The current OMSC was adopted in 2022. This will be the 2025. We just recently had a code committee for this. They met twice between August 29th and September 12th. The board packet today includes the full matrix of all that highlights all the draft changes to the amendments and the code review committee's recommendations. The proposed changes do have a minimal fiscal impact. Later in the meeting, Mark will be going over the matrix and kind of helping the board kind of review the matrix. But I do have to let the board know that the first part of this review will be considered our rulemaking advisory committee for the provisions of the 2025 Oregon Mechanical Specialty Code. So during this first initial portion of the rulemaking advisory committee, all board members and any interested members of the public will be acting as this rulemaking advisory committee, and the discussion will be open. Specifically, the group must consider the potential fiscal impacts and economical impacts of the rulemaking and any potential racial equity impacts of this rulemaking. We'll leave the discussion open between board members and public. Once that's done, I will close the rulemaking advisory committee portion of the meeting, and then we'll move back to our normally scheduled board only discussion of the matrix and the OMSC, and that's when Mark will kind of walk you guys through it. And then we'll go to our motion portion, which is including your board document today. If anyone's confused about the RAC portion versus the board portion, let me know. Otherwise, I can pass it back to the board and we can formally open the rulemaking advisory committee portion of the meeting. Thank you.
Any questions about that? Do we have to formally open it, Pierre? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, technically, yeah, this will now become the rulemaking advisory committee portion where we can speak on any feedback on the OMSC publicly or through the, or any board members who are acting as public, and specifically kind of trying to consider the potential fiscal and economic impacts of the questions we kind of want to address, and as well as any racial equity impacts. Those are kind of the main questions we were trying to get answered during the rulemaking advisory committee portion.
Okay, so Chair Hansen opens the rulemaking and advisory board meeting portion of this meeting, October 22nd at 9:44 a.m. to address fiscal impact or diversity equity impacts. We're now open.
Yeah, and this part is open to any general public if anyone's connected virtually.
Do we have anybody connected virtually, and how long do we need to keep this portion of the meeting open?
We can keep it open for a couple, if no one wants, it would be nice if someone would answer, but if there's no answers, we can just move on. So
yeah.
It really just depends on how much time's allotted, if there's speakers or not.
I don't think we have any speakers. I mean, I look at the whole, wait,
Yeah.
whoa. Yeah, we got some
Okay.
people.
If there's no answers, we can close the rulemaking advisory committee portion. We will close the RAC formally now, and we'll move on to the board, back to our board only discussion. This is where Mark will jump in, kind of talk about the matrix, talk about changes, fiscal impacts, kind of walk the board through what the committee is recommending for the OMSC, and then we can move towards board discussion and then the motion afterward. So thank you, Chair.
No problem. Mark, get ready, as I am about to close the Rules and Advisory Committee addressing fiscal impact and social justice at 9:45 a.m. on October 22nd. We are now closed. Now we're back to regular board business. And Mark, can you please walk us through this matrix?
Thank you, Chair Hansen. Again, Mark Heizer with Division. We are looking to, again, as Pierre noted, we had a code committee that reviewed, if those of you are familiar with the process, looked at the 2024 International Mechanical Code, overlaying that to with the current 2022 Oregon Mechanical Specialty Code, which is sort of our starting point, which has current Oregon addenda to it, and seeing what happens when you blend or merge those two pieces to see what changed at the national code level. When you see in your matrix, it says ORA. That's an Oregon amendment that was in the 2022 mechanical code. And if you see a note with IMC, that will point to an international mechanical code change from the 2021 International Mechanical Code to the 2024 International Mechanical Code. And there are links to the proposals and what they went through to get passed at the national model code level. And those inform what happens here at our committee today. We look at the outcomes of whether they retain the amendment, whether they did a change to the amendment or the change, and also looked at whether they felt there was a fiscal impact. I believe we may have a minor update to a couple of these pieces, but and so went through it. What we have in front of you today are all of the major items, substantive changes and minor changes that would be of to be brought to your attention today to walk through. I believe we can, and if there are questions of sort of what's in the matrix first, I'd be happy to take those. Otherwise, we can jump in, or unless Pierre has something else to say.
Not at the moment, Mark, it's all you.
Okay.
All right, I have a full screen here so I can see everybody. And if you have a question, please use the fancy little raise your hand button, please. And I will be able to see it and call on you. So go ahead, Mark.
Okay. And a quick question to the staff in the room. Will we be able to bring up a section if needed as to show to the language change in particular if people wish to see them in detail? If there's a question
Yeah,
on
I
anything.
could bring up the matrix, the IMC or whatever were needed. I have them ready. So
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
So we'll begin with the easy one, which is definitions. And to let everyone know, it was a relatively mild year for changes at the national model code level. And for definitions, nothing new or substantive came in under definitions, and there are a few Oregon specific ones, of course. What we use for defining is the code and gas code, mechanical code, and a building official. There are a few administrative definitions, that we've had over the years. None of those are changing. So pretty much that was retained for chapter 2. Oh, and real quick, Pierre, as far as review, do we want to look at by chapter or process on this?
Mark, it's kind of it's kind of at your discretion on what you want to highlight for the board. They have everyone should have a full copy of the matrix in their board packet. So if they have specific questions, they can ask you specific questions too, but it's kind of, if you want to just touch on the main highlights or however you'd like to proceed, it's the ball's in your court. Thank you.
Okay. And since there's no fiscal on this, I would assume, unless someone wishes to go into greater detail, we could call this chapter 2 is pretty much ready to go with no fiscal impact, correct? Unless further feedback on that. Moving on to chapter 3. The first, we're retaining some Oregon amendments about the path, when you're on the roof, when and where you have to, crossing over bumps in the building and getting from the roof access to equipment. Some of these are, we've maintained an exception for replacement or repair of existing equipment, to make sure that it didn't trigger, a lot of additional work for, say, when you replaced a fan, about potentially having to readjust some access to the equipment. The one big piece of section 306.5 are section where what would be IMC measures M 13-21 and 14-21. We've always had questions come back about, say, for roof hatches, when you are going through the roof to get to equipment, that there are requirements in OSHA for getting to those about clearances and the like. This is bringing in those pieces from the 2018 OSHA requirements into the code to, make sure that you have clearances and something to grab onto when you get out of the hatch. And it does change some of the dimensions on the ladder that you would use to get to the roof. So that was brought in via a national model code change. That's really something that would have been done anyway. However, it hasn't been in code before, but really under real fiscal impact, it was something that was done regardless. So any questions on that one?
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there some language that we could put in there to require all existing roof hatches be brought up to minimum safety standards? I'm joking a little bit, but there's so many. The real problem is existing buildings in this regard from a roof hatch point of view. That's the real problem. So I know we can't, but I would like to.
Comment taken. It would be a little difficult on the language and dealing with
very difficult
Oregon OSHA to help us out on that. So
yep.
Moving on condensate disposal. Oh, excuse me. Section 307.2.1. We are maintaining our existing amendments on that. Looking at condensate disposal for the approved places of disposal. a new item that is brought in for an organ amendment is addressing condensate that may be subject to freezing. We're getting a lot more pieces of equipment that are running in refrigeration mode in winter, and maybe their lines may be subject to freezing in that place of disposal. To watch those, just bringing in some additional language to be a little more clear about those places of disposal. Yes, Kevin.
Would that be like a heat pump water heater, for example?
That was where the question came from, yes, is that they were, one installer in Central Oregon was having to make some service calls because the drain line was freezing up and the equipment was shutting down. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
So that wraps up Chapter 3 items, some of the main pieces there. Any questions or comments or further items or that you might wish to bring up that would be on?
I have none. I see no hands.
All right. Moving forward to Chapter 4, this gets a little more fun. So looking at Section 401.2. In the past, when we looked at natural ventilation for spaces versus mechanical ventilation for spaces, for a while we left to avoid having differences between what's called natural ventilation in the mechanical code versus natural ventilation in the structural code, where the architect is doing design and looking at pieces. We left the language for natural ventilation would be what would be in the structural code. This go round, given there have been a few changes in when you need mechanical ventilation, and given that the mechanical designer would really still be responsible for potentially ventilation, determining, yes, I really do need mechanical ventilation here, or when they do take advantage of natural ventilation. The structural board said, this should really be over in the mechanical code so that you can look at, so the mechanical designers are looking at both natural and mechanical ventilation. And so that's all coming over here. So we no longer go to Chapter 12 of the structural code when we talk about natural ventilation. Everything's now in the mechanical code when we're looking at ventilation for human occupants. So as part of this, we had to remove a sentence regarding dwelling units. That's also something that's coming through the model code about dwelling unit ventilation. A new amendment was to adopt ventilation for dwelling unit requirements, but removed the reference to energy code, because model code says when required under the energy code. That's always been an issue. And when the energy code says seal the building, do mechanical ventilation. Well, we have that energy code is adopted by us, and so there's no reason to leave that. When required by the when building air sealing is required, do this. We don't have to say that because it is adopted. It's just really more a administrative piece to change that portion. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to blow some pieces up here so I can read them on my screen a little better, if you'll forgive me. And so that would cover the 401.2 and 402 portions of the code. Moving on to 403, there are several pieces, and we'll go down through the bullet points real quick, and because one of them will be a little bit longer and detailed discussion. Under 403.2.2, we are retaining current Oregon amendments about transfer air, and they're modified slightly, not a substantive change there. outdoor exhaust and local air change rates for 403.3. This one is a relatively, they tried to do this in the last model code. It's finally coming through now, is that if you're an R2, R3, or R4 dwelling unit, regardless of the number of stories above grade plane, you use the same requirements for ventilating a dwelling unit. In the past, there was a odd formula for, quote, high-rise dwelling units to have one ventilation rate and subject to the designer's revisions, and which would be based on the volume of the dwelling unit versus low-rise dwelling units under section 403.3.1, I believe it is, or 403.3.2. There was a completely different formula based on square footage and number of bedrooms. So, and they came up with very different answers for ventilation rates. So this is now simplifying how you determine the ventilation rate for dwelling units by not going to one book versus the other. And it was very confusing because we'd get lots of questions on, let's say for a mixed use building, you had 2 stories of apartments above 1 story of retail commercial, or 2 stories, what code that wound up in for determining the ventilation rate. This just really simplifies things to get it to where if it's a dwelling unit, R2, 3, or 4 occupancy, simple, easy to understand formula for determining the ventilation rate. Under table 403.3.1.1, that's the really big table that has, do you require the amount of ventilation per square foot, the amount of ventilation per number of occupants per 1,000 square feet, really big table. There are a few changes in there. One change that came from National Model Code was that they were adding in a new method for, I believe it was adult changing rooms as part of this. They did some clarification, and we had to do a little bit extra about occupancies other than science labs, and noting that some of these exhausts are environmental air. You'll see in some of the footnotes, modifying what's in the tables to make sure they still work with past organ amendments. Also, adult changing stations were added. And if we want, then we can talk about the outdoor air, the actual change to the ventilation rate under 403.3.2.1 and the public comment on, which does have a potential fiscal impact on the ventilation rate for both low-rise and high-rise dwelling units. Could we bring that one up maybe for showing on screen? So one of the additional requirements that's coming out of this is an absolute requirement for mechanical ventilation for dwelling units, either supply air, exhaust system, or a combination thereof. And so since this now applies to all R2, R3, and R4 units, this also does affect the folks over at the low-rise apartments that are covered under the residential board. We'll have to review these numbers and look at it. If you'll scroll down to equation 4-9, the current code is the ventilation rate is taking the floor area. If you'll see under equation 4-9, the current equation that's been for some time has been 0.01 times the floor area. So if you had 1,000 square foot building, you'd need 10 CFM under that portion. Then you took 7.5 times the number of bedrooms plus 1. So if you had 2 bedrooms, that would be number of bedrooms plus 1 is 3 times 7.5. That would give you the total ventilation rate. Oregon has had some prior big changes that aren't in the model code, especially when it comes to our kitchens, ventilation requirement. The one issue that's been up for discussion is, yes, ASHRAE standard 62.2 had gone, and the model code have moved to 0.03. This represents about a 40 to 60% increase in the amount of ventilation required for dwelling units. It does represent a cost increase. I believe it was said of $800 potentially per unit for the typical unit, up to that much. The issue we're looking very closely, just from division standpoint, of both first cost for affordable housing and also the energy use that comes with that, and balancing that with indoor, the need for good indoor air quality, and also looking at potentially during high smoke levels. The committee did put forward the 0.03, knowing that this is going to go to the residential board and that we're looking for what have been a fairly substantive increase, and looking at the potential additional costs and so forth, that the division was looking at sort of a halfway between to a 0.02 multiplier for the floor area as a recommendation. That might make it easier for the residential board to consider, and also looking at, first costs, energy costs, but balancing that with several things that we have in the residential and that Oregon has for higher ventilation rates for bathrooms, higher ventilation rates for kitchens, and the fact that we require the kitchen to exhaust to the exterior. Those are some big things that came out of the construction claims task force. That would still be up to the board. The current piece before you is the 0.03 multiplier. And one other thing that we have going forward that's not in model code that is done for all of our dwelling units is that when you do have a bathroom, this was required for the high rise, but not for the low rise dwelling units, about having a switch for bathrooms. It's just like for all of our homes. In our residential code, we require a time switch and or other controls, such as a humidistat or other thing, to make sure that they can get, after someone takes a shower, that it really does dry out in the bathrooms. This would be making it applicable to all our units. It's currently only for high rise and single family homes under the residential code. We're bringing that language in just to make sure that it applies to all dwelling units. So, any questions or comments from the board on this one? Because it is section 403 is a rather big one.
Mark, can I interject real quick too?
Yes.
The record Pierce about policy council division for 403 3.3.2.1. You said the fiscal impact for 0.03 would be up to $800, correct?
Up to,
and then
0 to 800, depending on what you're doing.
0 to 800, and then for 0.02 is 0 to 400.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that for the board, that moving up to 0.02 would be 0 to 400, and going to 0.03 would be 0 to 800 as the potential fiscal impact.
Thank you, Pierre.
Yep. Sorry, questions now can be asked.
No questions.
Okay. So the current recommendation is the 0.03. Does the board wish to go with that or a different number? Just stick with the 0.03.
Administratively, it's easier if we stick with the 0.03, isn't it?
we have organ amendments in the past, and yes, this is a whole new method. So it could be easier that way. Yes.
If I may, through
Kevin?
the chair. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I'm looking at the example given by Mike Moore in the written public comment. And he gives the example of an 800 square foot dwelling unit. And we're talking about like 7 or 8 CFM difference between these different levels. I'm impressed that could cause $400 to $800 difference. I'm wondering how you even get a fan that's 38 CFM, for example, versus, well, let's see, what numbers am I looking at? 30 versus 40. Most fans I've seen are about 50, so I think you're kind of covered no matter what. But I haven't done the cost estimate, and I know there's more impacts than just the fan. There's the duct, and there's the grill, and everything else. So
those were figures from Mr. Moore. So
oh, okay, fair enough.
and ranges. So depends on current
Sure.
methodologies and the like. So that's, and then some of them, if it's supply only, it may be coming from something like a PTAC or the furnace where it's done differently versus exhaust only version. So there's a lot of different ways this can be done.
Good point. That's true. The supply side can be more complex. Thanks.
For the record, Pierre Sabah, to answer Chair Hansen's question about what would be easier administratively. The board can, if the board chooses to change the to make a different decision than the committee's recommendation of 0.03 to, let's say, 0.02, we would just need a motion to amend and approve today's matrix, and we would just include in that motion what was being amended. So I can help with that motion if necessary, if the board chooses to differ from the committee's recommendation. And also for the
I have a
record,
question. Oh, sorry.
yeah, and just so you know, this, since it does pertain to low rise, it will go back to RMSB, and if they decide something different than what the matrix states, we will bring it back to review to the VEC board. So that's also just to keep in mind for the future.
Eric
Whoever had a
Fanning has,
question.
yeah, question to the chair.
Go ahead, Eric.
The 0.03 is just, we're aligning with ASHRAE's standard. Is that correct?
Yes, it changed in 2000.
It's IMC, isn't it?
It's both at this point. So they've had different standards coming into the IMC version, but the 62.1 has updated as well. But we also, and the point is that yes, there are certain things where we go beyond 62.1 is the.
Thank you for that.
Oh, and I'm sorry, that is 62.2. So ASHRAE standard 62.1 used to be for commercial, and 62.1 was for commercial, including commercial high rise. 62.2 was residential version standard. They have now updated to where 62.1 is only for commercial, and then all dwelling units are now under 62.2's committee now. So they've sort of aligned with where we're going in the model code, that 62.2 will apply to a high-rise condo as just this on a dwelling unit in a high-rise condo, just the same as a 3-story apartment complex now, or a single family home.
Thank you.
Kevin?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Hansen, and pardon my lapse in protocol. Through the chair, just a comment. I'm in favor of the 0.03. Thank you.
All right.
I'm not in favor of the 0.3. I like as much exhaust in anything as I possibly can. But that's just my
We will
Personal.
take that. It looks like that's the general opinion of the board. We'll move forward with that. So we're done with 403.
Yep.
Under 407.1, we're continuing with organ amendments about when it comes to I2 facilities and aligning with Oregon rules and licensing requirements of OHA, just maintaining that current Oregon amendment. 404.1, when it comes to enclosed parking garages, we're maintaining our existing amendments to make it clearer of within the energy code and in the mechanical code, you are allowed to reduce the amount of ventilation when you have sensors in the garage that will then note when there's an issue, and then they bring the fan speeds up again. That we're just maintaining that Oregon amendment. And that is it for chapter 4. Given no further comments, we will look at chapter 5 on exhaust outlets. During the review of, there's been in the residential code and the mechanical code, an allowance for factory built combination intake and exhaust. When it's coming from the same space, you can maintain, there are these units that allow you to be closer between the exhaust. It's an integral exhaust and supply outlet. Normally under the code, an exhaust outlet has to be 10 feet from an intake. So this allows that close spacing. And it has been in the residential code. And but one note from the code committee, they recommended approving an additional change allowing the use of ASHRAE 62.1 normative appendix B, and just making sure we note that that's available. What that allows under the standard for commercial ventilation, they have under appendix B, if you have the exhaust blowing at a certain velocity, you can be closer to the intake opening. So you can do that calculation so that you can be closer than 10 feet if you make sure that what's going out of the space, is ejected far enough that it's not affecting what's coming into the space. It would be an allowed calculation. They would just like to make sure that we note that, yes, it is allowed, that is more clarity is being allowed to use normative appendix B, so that, again, on a lot of primarily multifamily, but on some other buildings, it's good to be able to, note that there is a method that if the designer is really looking at where the exhaust is blowing out, they can be closer than that 10-foot distance, which can be difficult sometimes on some buildings. So that was just sort of a editorial clarification they would like to have. 501.6, this is an IMC change, which does have a potential cost increase. It addresses common ducts serving separate dwelling or sleeping units. What they are trying to clarify, which normally was a normal design practice when we look at, say, something that's like a subduct system. If you have more than one dwelling unit fan connecting to a single duct going out, this language is to make sure that if fan A is on, it's not going to it will go to the exterior. It won't go backwards and back into the building. That's the reason for this, is to make sure that when two different dwelling units are combining, should they be combining their exhaust into the same duct system, that there will be something to make sure it continues flowing outward, because a lot of residential fans don't have the greatest backdraft dampers on them to keep air from going back in from apartment A to apartment B. So was that clear to the board members? So that was section 501.6. Under 504.9.2, the mechanical board and residential board have always said that when you do fastening of domestic dryer exhaust, about using screws or fasteners. Model code tried to come up with some way to say, oh yeah, if the screws are this big, you can use them on dryers. If it's small enough and doesn't stick in far enough, the board in the past has said, well, it's really hard to see in the field unless you take the screw out to see what length the screw was. So it's still been using tape or other systems to attach that duct. Moving on to 504.9.3, continuing the reference about UL 2158 on transition ducts. That really has to do with the dryer connection. It's something we don't regulate, is that little bit from, it's not there in the building when we go to it, the connector from the dryer to the wall, but so that's moving forward again. We're continuing the exhaust for domestic cooking equipment exceptions. Also under 505.6 on the other than group R amendment, we're just deleting a section to continue our alignment with section 507.1.2. The big one is really a clarification about group I occupancies under 505.7. This is required under the structural code as well, that when you have domestic appliances or domestic cooking appliances in these I occupancies where, they could be left unattended, could have a fire, it requires a better than normal. So you have a residential range in an I occupancy. There are special hoods that have integral fire suppression and a relay to shut the power to the stove should there be a fire. That is required under the structural code. This is making clear in the mechanical code that that's required on the other side. The code currently allows it, but it is saying that it does need to be a 500 CFM range hood over if you have a domestic cooking appliance like a plain old residential stove, that it does need to be 500 CFM, which would also require makeup air for that. But and these are UL, effectively it's requiring a UL 300A hood, for those who are familiar with those. That is for 505.7 and 505.8. One new section is under for the grease tests. When you do a type 1 commercial grease exhaust system, there are some new expanded provisions that allow not only a light test. So in the past, look and make sure that you didn't have a hole in your welded duct or your factory duct. You would put a light down and you'd look and see if there was light coming through, and then that was one way of determining if there was a leak in your commercial grease duct. For some time, there have been also water spray tests that are also in there. This is really clarifying all the potential paths or additional paths to test grease duct. So you can they have some systems that they drop down, sort of a power washer that goes down in. You run that and see whether there's any water that comes out of the duct. It's another way to make sure the grease duct is well sealed. So that's adding options and clarifying that those options are available. Under commercial kitchen hoods, there has been a bit of editorial reordering and logic of when you need a type 1 hood, when you need a type 2 hood, the exceptions for use of a type 1 hood, and other options such as UL 910, where it's integral to the equipment, and other paths. Most of this is primarily editorial items 4021, M40 M4121, M4221. Really normal standard practice. It's just editorial rearranging of how those exceptions are applied to whether or not you need a type 1 hood. Really editorial. M43-21 adds an exception for ovens listed and labeled for use with wood-fired fuel in accordance with UL 2162, invented in accordance with the manufacturer's installation instructions. This aligns with something that this board did some time ago, and it was actually done through a statewide code interpretation. That is interpretation 15-01. Model code language in the past has been very unclear. It made it sound as if you had one of these wood-fired pizza ovens, you would literally have to disconnect a flue, discharge it into a range hood, and have a fire suppression system for a perfectly well-functioning fireplace. And we recognized this some time ago. It is now finally moved into National Model Code. So hats off to the folks here on this board for looking at this in the past, because they've clarified some rather ambiguous language to make sure that yes, you can put in an oven and vent it per manufacturer's installation instructions. It'll be listed as National Model Code Change M44-21. One of the exceptions has sort of, again, they've done a lot of moving around of where some of the exceptions are found. It's primarily editorial. It will probably mean we need to have an extra little guide to tell people where the new locations for these are and retrain our building officials, but really an editorial piece. They added an exception M45-21, and this is about some commercial electric dishwashers now have a self-contained condensing system. These are ones that would be exempt from being under a type 2 hood. So, good old commercial dishwashers where you raise the door and a lot of steam comes out. They now have versions that won't have the massive amount of steam coming out. They don't need to be under a type 2 hood. They're listed and labeled for not having to be under a type 2 hood. And so that was M45-21, M46-21 from the National Model Code. This is really a further clarification of and a little bit of editorial rejiggering of how and when you need a type 2 hood or don't need a type 2 hood. Again, back to, we used to call it the Quiznos rule. There aren't any Quiznos left in Oregon, so we're going to have to call it the Subway sandwich toaster rule now. So that's it for the really big part on commercial hoods. A lot of editorial reorganizing, but no substantive change. It looks like it's a lot more than it is. We just have to make sure we could retrain everybody on the path to get from A to B to Z for when you do or don't need a type 1 or a type 2 hood. And that gets back to the Oregon amendment that happens with section 507.3 about the use of residential appliances in a commercial application. We've had very good success with that language of, when you put in a domestic range in, say, a church break room or at a fire station where the use isn't as a true commercial application, the allowance to for type 1 or for type 1 and type 2 hood applications, continuing forward with that one, excuse me, that also is section on the next page. If we move to page, I got to get my
Three.
page numbers correct. On
Page 3.
Yep, 34507.1.2. Continuing organ amendments there. So that is it for chapter 5. Excuse me, I'm getting all my numbers straight. Apologies to the chair and the board. Any items of concern or for further discussion on chapter 5? All right, we will move on to chapter 6, and we'll talk about return air openings, primarily having to do with model code change 51-21. It was clarifying, when the language was sort of unusual, that you can take return from the same room you're serving, getting that clarified in a little bit more detail, especially when you deal with things like boiler rooms and places where there may be open combustion, or especially in bathroom and toilet rooms, about whether or not it can be recirculated on itself. There is additional language under 53-21 about noting that, yes, you can take return from a closet because people were concerned about some of them that would be sitting there and potentially having mold issues and growth. They're allowing a little more clarity of when you can take return from a closet, and that it is allowed under that proposal or change to the model code. For duct construction in dwelling units on the minimum sheet metal thicknesses, the model code on the last code adoption had gone to a rather huge detailed table for the sheet metal thickness for dwelling units. Oregon has retained relatively simplified tables of the minimum duct thickness for what's needed for a dwelling unit. Some of the tables were just overly complex and would be seeing pressures that just don't take place in a single family or in a dwelling unit. So the committee voted to retain the current Oregon amendments on that are a little more simple than the model code. That is it for chapter 6. Any questions? Chapter 7 for combustion air. There were no revisions. It is maintaining as it was both at the model code level and the committee code level for relative to the current 2022 mechanical code. And we can repeat that language for chimneys and vents in chapter 8. No changes. Under chapter 9, there are the very first item, IMC and fuel gas, section 7-21, part 2. There is now a UL listing for cremation furnaces and direct fed commercial incinerators. There is now language noting that there is such a listing, and that it's a listed appliance now within our code, and that follows up also with our current section under section 931 in even more detail there. So 907.1 change and 931 change, all are just sort of bringing it up to current model code UL listings for those types of equipment. No substantive change there. So that is it for that was all that happened in chapter 9. Under chapter 10, we maintain the current Oregon amendment. Oh, Kevin, I'm sorry, Chair.
Kevin, I didn't.
Sorry.
Kevin.
Through the chair, on section 931, incinerators and crematories, that M62-21 mentions steam bath equipment.
I am sorry, that got that has the title is different. Under steam bath equipment, they do now have equipment listings for those as well that come in, and we do have to make sure we're aligned with the plumbing code on that to make sure that, and they have specific requirements of up to the connection to the steam bath and downstream. So when people are putting in these fancy steam bath water heaters, they aren't actually, there's a division of it's no longer potable water when it comes out. And now we're dropping into the mechanical coats. They did add that, and I do apologize for the notation there on 931.
Gotcha.
We're
Thank
not
you.
approving the International Mechanical Code where they're bringing it in. It says disapprove.
And that was because, I will clarify that one. That is because what was being brought in was actually is covered under the plumbing code. That's the reason why they aren't bringing that one in. I apologize on that one.
Okay.
Going back through these again. So moving forward to chapter 10, again, this is making sure that what is in the mechanical code, the items that don't fall under the plumbing or boiler pressure vessel programs is noted in chapter 10. There were no changes made because we have to make sure we do have that alignment, and where either of those programs default to us and it falls in our authority, we have just those portions in chapter 10. Refrigeration, chapter 11 has probably the biggest items or the most items. And a lot of this is relative to the changes that are coming forward with the new refrigerant types. Most equipment is going to have the new A2L refrigerant. One thing that we have added, just to let people know, is that we have added the requirement that persons engaged in the repair, disposal of equipment that could release refrigerants shall be certified under EPA Section 608 requirements. This is bringing in to make people aware that if you're handling refrigerant, there are EPA requirements for those people who do handle it. We bring in, when there's stuff that's relative to wood burning appliances, there are DEQ requirements that we make sure we note here, that people are aware of that so that things don't get lost in the mix. And it's good to make sure people know that, they should have these requirements when they're doing, or the certifications when they're working with refrigeration. Moving to the second item in chapter 11 is 1101.1.1, refrigerants other than ammonia. They have finally noted that there is, one item is that refrigerants containing carbon dioxide shall also comply with a new IIAR standard for carbon dioxide refrigeration systems, since those operate at a relatively high pressure. There's a special standard that's outside the normal refrigerants that are used. So there are sort of three classes now. There's going to be ammonia, CO2, and then looking at basic refrigerants that we're all used to in normal operation relative to HVAC systems and commercial refrigeration. We do have we don't adopt, and this has been in the past, we retain the current organ amendment when there's language about when you change a refrigerant. This is sort of on existing systems that we don't cover in that sort of maintenance area. We delete that. On refrigeration standards, the current SAM will, for allowing the use of ASHRAE standard 15-2022 is in the statewide alternate method. A majority of that is coming in under the under the IMC. They've brought all that in under the IMC. ASHRAE standard 15-2022 is the reference refrigerant standard. At some point, the reason for the SAM is that soon ASHRAE standard 15-2025 will be coming out, and it will have some additional refrigerants that will be in that probably aren't in our current code. We will need to update that SAM at a future date, just letting everyone know that we're not going to have it disappear. We'll just have to come back and revisit it once the new version of ASHRAE standard 15 comes out. On the on the fifth item for sections 1104.3.1 and 3.2 about air conditioning for human comfort. Again, this is really aligning with ASHRAE standard 15. It has no fiscal impact on that. Standard A2 or B2, B3 refrigerants won't be used. It's just, that was just a editorial correction. Under section 1105.9 about machinery room means of egress. We make sure on means of egress, we point to the requirements that are found in the structural code. That's where people are setting up the means of egress. There are similar requirements there. We want to make sure that we're in alignment and that the architects they have done the same analysis. So we don't want conflicts. So we don't have that here in the mechanical code, because I don't know of many mechanical designers who are laying out paths of egress. At least I tried not to when I was doing design. They didn't trust me with that. Under N 1108.1.1 installer certification, again, we're putting in what we've had in an informative note in the past about refrigerant piping and joint connections need to be by persons. When it's a larger pipe, we have it under Oregon rule already that they're supposed to have either the welding or brazing certificate. This is just bringing in officially into the code itself what's in Oregon rule to make sure that, yes, a building official or a mechanical official can say, yes, please show me your certification if you're welding or brazing a 4-inch refrigerant pipe. Currently, it's hard to then say, oh yeah, I'm enforcing a rule. We're bringing that into code. So it's really just informative and not a fiscal impact at this point. Last piece for chapter 11 is section 1109.2.5. It was brought to our attention that something that is in ASHRAE standard 15 did not get brought into the mechanical code. They brought in as a reference. It had to do with the routing of refrigerants in shafts, and it would have required, without this revision, that a VRF system with A2L refrigerant would have had to have been in a 2-hour shaft if it went more than 2 floors. And at the model code level, they made the revision with just a minor strikeout that any refrigerant, that the 2-hour shaft is required when the refrigerant exceeds the table requirements for needing to be in a machine room. So if it's, where it would be a hazard if it leaked, that's when it needs to be in the 2-hour shaft. So for any refrigerant. So now there was a lot of panic from all of industry because it really would have added a substantive amount of cost, and the shafts for being able to put in a VRF system now. So it was a great point that was brought forward. This has been moved through the 2027 IMC adoption process. It's not fully through it, but it was approved there and should be in the published 2027 IMC. And our current, the statewide alternate method, or was that interpretation, for use of ASHRAE standard 15 really would have allowed it for A2L, but it would have been a circuitous path. So here we're just making it perfectly clear by going that this is already approved in ASHRAE Standard 15. We're bringing in that language before the model code does. And doing a lot to avoid a lot of expense. Any questions on the big refrigeration chapter? Okay, we will move on to hydronic piping. There's just been a change to make sure that hydronic piping can also include radiant heating and cooling, and snow melt and ice melt systems are hydronic piping. We have piping requirements and we never mentioned that that's hydronic piping. So thank you, model code, for clarifying that it's covered in code. We maintain our existing amendments under 1209.1 about materials. The tables are catching up with us. One item that is new in model code was from change M97-21 about addressing radiant tube replacement. It's not a fiscal impact, just providing more options for people. And again, since they're finally mentioning snow melt and ice tubing replacement, they have put in a section 1209.7 to address snow melt tubing. So that is it for chapter 12 for hydronic piping. Doesn't look like there are any questions. So chapter 13, no changes made for fuel oil piping and storage. Chapter 14, no changes were made at the model code level. None were made to any Oregon amendments. We always made sure that we had to distinguish between solar thermal systems that served domestic hot water or in the plumbing code world, that's remaining the same. Of appendices A, B, C, D, and E, no changes. And again, we note the ones that we do not adopt and are not available for adoption. So that will bring us to gas piping. Again, this is, there's an existing Oregon amendment about where secondary drains leave the building. It's the ability to distinguish which one, if you have two condensate drains leaving the building, one is from, directly from a condensing appliance, that the one that is the overflow secondary drain is clearly distinguished, because that's when you want to know there's a problem. When water is flowing out of your secondary drain, you need to know time to check something. And so that's an existing Oregon amendment that's carrying forward. We're continuing with our language to make sure that, when you do have CSST corrugated stainless steel tubing, that when it is bonded, it needs to be done in accordance with the electrical code and the manufacturer's installation instructions. When you're bonding items to the building bonding grounding system, I know Brian will scream at me for this, for not getting electrical language correct. You need to have an electrician do that. You do not want to have items bonded to the wrong location or against the electrical code, which could create a potential electrical shock issue, protection issue. And the last item, CO404.7 about protection against physical damage. We are still carrying through that there are some pipes with the new, press fit type piping, that there is the ability to use piping that's thinner than Schedule 40. Schedule 40, we're not exactly worried about that iron pipe getting hit with a nail. It's not going to go through that. However, if you're using thinner gauge steel pipe for that application, you can puncture the others. And so provide that strike protection for that, just like you would for potentially a plastic pipe or other type. So that's all that happened in the gas world. as far as revisions. Are there any questions on that? Especially from the gas people.
Looks good.
All right.
Yeah. So that being said, we now have, if there are no further questions for Mark or Pierre, we have the opportunity to vote on adopting these changes or adopting the 2025 Oregon Mechanical Specialty Code. And we can amend anything and approve the code with recommendations, or we can disapprove or just flat out approve. Do we have any discussion? Do we have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve the changes.
Chair Hansen, for the record, Pierre Sabah. We do want to follow the motions that are in the help sheet today. So if we have the motion to approve, whoever is motioning should read the motion as written in the help sheet.
Eric Fanning through the chair.
Go ahead, Eric.
I'll make the motion. Motion to approve the proposed code recommendations and forward to the administrator for rulemaking and subsequent adoption, with the finding that the added cost, if any, is necessary for the health and safety of the occupants or the public, or necessary to conserve scarce resources.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Through the chair, I second the motion.
Thank you, Chris. Do we have any further discussion? So Katie, do I ask you to call the roll for the vote?
Yes.
Katie, would you please call the roll for the vote?
Walter Cottle, Walter,
Walter, are you there? don't see him.
he was just there. I'll come back. Kevin Duell,
Aye.
you, Chris Miller,
Aye.
Jed Sherman.
Aye.
Kevin Ferguson,
Aye.
thank you. Vice Chair Eric Fanning,
Aye.
Walter Cottle,
Aye.
thank you, Walter, and Chair Jay Hansen.
Aye.
The motion was unanimous.
Okay. Does anyone on this board or staff have any announcements for us at this time? Hearing none, being no further business, I'm going to call the October 22nd, 2024 Mechanical Board meeting adjourned at 10:51. Don't forget,
Thank you,
we're meeting
everybody.
in December again. December.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Chair
Thank you.
Hansen.
Happy Halloween. Be safe out there. Bunch of
Thank you,
crazy
Chair Hansen and
kids.
board members. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, staff and Chair Hansen.